name the primary and secondary endocrine glands and then the hormones that are associated with each. Now, the endocrine system is one of the most integrated systems. It is made of the glands, which are from epithelial tissue. There are two groups of endocrine organs, ones that we consider to be primary organs, such as the hypothalamus, for example, and their main role is in secreting hormones. That's kind of their main job. Secondary endocrine organs are other organs in the body who have a primary role that's not associated with the endocrine system, but they do secrete hormones that have a secondary endocrine function. So one of the examples here is going to be the heart. The heart is going to secrete some hormones that have a role in the endocrine relay, but it's not necessarily an endocrine gland, so to speak. So the primary endocrine glands are the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, the thyroid gland, and the parathyroid. So the parathyroids are actually embedded in the thyroid gland. The thymus, which is going to be anterior to the heart. All right. So the pineal is going to be at the base of the brain. The hypothalamus is also going to be just around the midbrain. The pituitary gland is also going to be in that area. The thyroid and parathyroid are going to be in the neck region. So the thyroid is this butterfly-shaped gland here. And then in the back of the thyroid is where we have this much smaller parathyroids, 4 of them embedded. The thymus is going to be anterior to the heart. It is posterior to the sternum, which is part of the thoracic bones. And the thymus is really not visible in adults. I'm sure you'll see this in the human cadavers when you get into the lab. It's usually involuted in adulthood. Anything beyond puberty, the thymus is really a small mass of fat because its role in developing T cells is pretty much over beyond puberty. The adrenal glands are in the abdomen. They're going to be on top of the kidneys. So we've got 2 kidneys, bilateral. One on each top of the kidneys is where we have the adrenal glands. And we've talked a little bit about the adrenal glands previously. We talked about their role in the autonomic nervous system, the medulla of the gland, specifically the inner parts of the gland, acts as a postganglionic neuron in releasing the norepinephrine and epinephrine in the sympathetic nervous system. So we've talked a little bit about the inner part of the adrenal gland. What we will speak about here with the endocrine system is the outer part of the adrenal gland, the so-called adrenal cortex, okay? The pancreas is another endocrine hormone or gland. This one is also similar to the adrenal gland in that it's mixed. It has some portions that are endocrine and some portions that are exocrine. And then lastly, the gonads. The gonads are the reproductive organs, the testes in males, the placenta in pregnant women, but also the ovaries in all females. So the placenta can be an endocrine functioning gland, specifically in pregnancy. All right, looking at the secondary endocrine glands, the heart was one of the main examples we talked about. The heart has other roles, more so in the cardiovascular system, but it does secrete atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP, and that has an endocrine role. The kidneys are also secreting erythropoietin, which is what helps to stimulate the development of new erythrocytes or red blood cells and new white blood cells in the bone marrow. The GI tract secretes several hormones, cholecystokinin or CCK, secretin, and gastrin, which all help in the but the absorption and secretion of the gastrointestinal tract. The liver secretes IGF, which are growth factors or insulin-like growth factors that help with the overall growth of tissues and cells in our body. Skin and kidneys secrete the active form of vitamin D, vitamin D3. And then fat also plays a role in that it secretes leptin, which is a hormone that helps with hunger signaling, etc. So here are some of the glands that are not necessarily endocrine glands, but we want to remember that they do have an endocrine function. They secrete hormones, which play a role in the endocrine signaling. Okay. Moving on to the second and third objectives. The second one is to describe the links between the hypothalamus with the anterior and posterior lobes of the pituitary. And the third is going to be talking about the role of tropic hormones in regulating the release of other hormones, including the feedback loops involved in this process. So the first objective is really describing the hypothalamus and the pituitary. These are the two master endocrine glands. These pretty much give all the instructions that are passed down to the other tertiary endocrine glands. And then the third objective is talking about how the hormones that are released from the hypothalamus and pituitary will eventually send those instructions down to the tertiary glands. Okay, so the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, these are the sort of the CEO, are the glands that are in charge of the endocrine signaling, the endocrine axis. The hypothalamus is found here in the brain. So it's just below the thalamus, right? So just the space just below. The pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus via this stalk. So this is how we can already begin to see the connection between the hypothalamus, which is a little bit above, and it's going to be sending signals and hormones down to the pituitary, which is physically attached to that region of the brain. The pituitary has two lobes. It's got an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe, which have two separate functions. Same gland, but the anterior and posterior parts of the gland come from two separate embryologic developments, right? The posterior part is going to be neurologic in its function. The anterior part is going to be more endocrine. So the anterior part of the gland is what we're going to really focus on. And then the infundibulum is that stalk-like connection. So notice the hypothalamus is here, the pituitary gland is here, anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and then the stalk that connects these two parts is what we call the infundibulum. And as you will go on to see, because hormones and neurons are passing down from hypothalamus to pituitary, the infundibulum will contain the axons as well as the cells that are passing those hormones and neurotransmitters down. Let's look at the neurohormones, right? So we just described this earlier. There are certain hormones that are being made in the hypothalamus that need to be passed down into the pituitary gland itself. And we call these hormones neurohormones because they're being secreted by neurons instead of actual endocrine glands. So the two peptide hormones are going to be antidiuretic hormone, also called ADH or vasopressin. This is made in the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. So if you look at the hypothalamus more globally, we can think about several cluster of cells that have different names. These are called nuclei. The paraventricular cluster is the group of neurons, right, or nuclei that are making the ADH or the vasopressin hormone. That is going to be transmitted via axons. Remember, this is a neuron here. The soma of the neuron is up in the hypothalamus. The axons project through the infundibulum and down onto the pituitary, specifically the posterior part of the pituitary. And we're not going to speak too much about these hormones here. We'll talk about them when we look at water balance and osmolarity in second part of the course in AMP2. When we talk about the kidneys, we will bring up ADH again. But we just want to understand that that's what's happening specifically for the posterior part of the pituitary. All right. The second hormone that is also being released by the supraoptic nucleus, so a second group of nuclei, is oxytocin. And oxytocin is going to be important for milk ejection. So it's going to be secreted all throughout pregnancy. It's going to be released more in higher quantities after birth. and it's going to be responsible for the letdown of milk. Now, I really want to make the distinction here between milk ejection and milk production, because we will talk about another hormone, prolactin, in just a minute, and prolactin is responsible for milk production. This is what is made in higher quantities throughout the entire pregnancy. This is what causes the engorgement of breast tissue, and it is really the making of milk, whereas oxytocin is the ejection or the letdown of that milk. All right. Let's look at the trophic hormones. So these are the hormones that we're going to spend a little bit more time on, and I want you to focus more so on. These are the hormones that are made by neurosecretory cells, again, in the hypothalamus, but the way that we communicate or transport these hormones to the anterior pituitary is slightly different than what happened with the posterior pituitary. So these hormones can be either stimulating or inhibiting, and they are transmitted by what is called a portal system. And a portal system, by definition, is where we have two capillary beds in series. So typically, in the circulatory system, blood goes from the heart to our arteries to capillaries, and then it goes back to veins and then back to the right side of the heart. When we encounter a portal system, of which there are about 3 or 4 in the human body, this is where we see blood going from one capillary bed. Instead of going back to the heart, it goes to another capillary bed in series. Okay, and so blood leaves an artery here, it goes to a capillary bed that we can see here. At this point, it's going to pick up these hormones. These neurosecretory cells are releasing these trophic hormones. It's going to pick those up into the capillary beds. And then instead of going back to the heart, it's going to go to another capillary bed, which is nearby, down here in the anterior pituitary, and then it's going to dump those off to the endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary. All right, so what we can already see established here is an axis, sort of a relay of signals from one point to the pituitary, and then from the pituitary, these cells here, these endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary, will drop off other hormones, which will go out into the venous system and go out into the peripheral circulation and go to the tertiary endocrine organs, such as the thyroid, the parathyroid, the adrenals, etc. So we have a hierarchy of signaling that's happening. The hypothalamus is releasing certain instructions that get picked up by the pituitary, which is going to further release certain instructions that will go out to all of our tertiary endocrine glands. Okay, but what we really want to highlight here is how that is happening by the design of the portal system that will pick up the hormones from the hypothalamus here, go down through the infundibulum, drop them off at a second capillary bed, and then pick up some other hormones that are being released from the endocrine cells here, and then take them out into the peripheral circulation. All right, so that's what we just described here. And in this way, the anterior pituitary gland will take the hormones that are coming from the hypothalamus, and it will determine whether or not it is a stimulatory hormone. If it is a stimulatory hormone, then the endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary will stimulate, right? They'll be stimulated to secrete another hormone in response. If it is an inhibitory hormone, then the endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary will be blocked or prevented from releasing that additional hormone out into the circulation. Okay, when that hormone is released, let's say it was a stimulatory hormone coming from the hypothalamus, it's picked up here in the first capillary bed, it flows through to the second capillary bed, and then it's going to stimulate the endocrine cells to release another hormone, and then that is going to travel into the blood supply and then go out to the distant endocrine glands. All right, now the other thing that I want to point out here is the consequence of the portal system. This will get a little bit into the clinical consequences. So because the blood that's leaving the hypothalamus has dropped off nutrients and oxygen. We can see that the color has changed here. It's now purple instead of red. That means that the blood that's leaving the hypothalamus is somewhat devoid of oxygen and nutrients, okay? And when it gets down here to the pituitary, it's going to have to undergo another exchange. And so it's going to become even more devoid of oxygen and nutrients. This is why the pituitary gland can sometimes be at risk for loss of oxygen, which we call infarction, which can be damaging, right? If the pituitary is not getting enough oxygen and nutrients, it can die, it can become necrotic, especially in pregnant women. So this is a big risk for pregnant women. As soon as they deliver their fetus, the pituitary gland is already so much larger because it naturally gets bigger during pregnancy in order to secrete the hormones that are required to sustain the growth of the fetus, the growth of the placenta, etc. The pituitary gland gets bigger. So we have two things that are happening here. We have a bigger gland that has been growing throughout pregnancy, and then we have bleeding that may be happening at pregnancy. And so pregnant women who have just delivered are at an even more a higher risk of seeing infarction or necrosis of the pituitary gland because it has a decrease in oxygen naturally, and then we have bleeding happening as a part of birth, and then we have a larger gland that needs even more oxygen. So all of those things can compound and put pregnant women at a higher risk for having necrosis of their pituitary gland. All right, let's talk about this axis here a little bit more. So these are some of the examples of the trophic hormones that are being released. And if you think about the word trophic just means that it has the ability to influence another tissue. So for example, the hypothalamus will release all of these hormones at the top here. Prolactin releasing hormone, PRH, also prolactin inhibitory hormone, PIH. Notice how the releasing hormone would be stimulating the pituitary, whereas the inhibitory hormone would be inhibiting the pituitary from releasing its own secretion. We've also got thyroid releasing hormone, or TRH, and then we've got cortisol releasing hormone, we've got growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH, we've got growth hormone inhibitory hormone, or GHIH, and then lastly, we've got gonadotropin releasing hormone, okay? And it's okay to remember the shortened form of these hormones. I will typically put both of these on the exam just so that you, if you're familiar with the contracted form, that's okay. So gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to specifically encourage the pituitary to stimulate FSH, which is follicular stimulating hormone, and LH, which is luteinizing hormone, and both of these will act on the gonads, testes, or ovaries, depending on male or female. Growth hormone hormones, whether it be the releasing hormone or the inhibitory hormone, will influence the anterpituitary, whether it be secretion or inhibition of growth hormone release. Cortisol releasing hormone will do the same thing to the pituitary, but it's going to encourage the release of ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone. That's going to act on the adrenal glands. And then thyroid releasing hormone will encourage the release of TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, and that is going to act on the thyroid gland. Prolactin is one of the first ones we mentioned. This is the one that we want to distinguish from oxytocin. Oxytocin is going to be responsible for milk ejection or letdown after birth, and then prolactin is going to be responsible for encouraging the breast to grow, right, to get larger, and to actually produce the alveolar secretions, which is basically milk, right? So milk production from prolactin versus milk ejection from oxytocin. If we look at the lower parts of the axis here, these are the tertiary endocrine glands that we mentioned earlier. So these are the glands that are going to receive instruction from the hormones that are coming from the anterpituitary when these hormones are released into the systemic circulation. So the hypothalamus will release its hormones into the capillary beds picked up in the portal circulation. Those will be sent to the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary, depending on whether it is an inhibitory or a releasing hormone, will be influenced to release these hormones, okay, into the systemic circulation. And then from there, the systemic circulation will transport these hormones to the tertiary endocrine glands, which are the breast, the thyroid gland, the adrenal cortex, the liver, and most of our body cells are going to be receptive to growth hormone, including our bone, our muscle cells, our kidney cells in some instances. And then as far as FSH and LH, it's going to be the gonads, right? The testes and the ovaries. And then from there, we have another layer of the actual effects that are brought about by these tertiary endocrine glands. We've got milk production from the breast tissue. We've got T3, T4 production from the thyroid gland. We've got cortisol production from the adrenal cortex. And then we've got insulin like growth factor from our body, muscle, bone, liver cells. And then from the testes and ovaries, we have androgens from the testes, and estrogen and progesterone from the ovaries. Okay, now this is a really global view of the endocrine system and all of the hormones. I expect you to sort of know what each of these structures are and where they are, right, where the breast is, the thyroid gland, and we'll talk about them in more detail, but I don't expect you to know the details of these axes just yet. For example, in AMP2, we will talk more about the reproductive system, and you'll learn a little bit more of the details of how estrogen and progesterone play their role and how they're released from the ovaries, for example. You'll learn a little bit more about the adrenals when we talk about the kidneys and so on. So I want you to have more of a global understanding of this axis, and then we'll fill in the details when we get to each of these individual systems. All right. And I will post this picture on Brightspace as well, just for you to review. Okay, so let's talk about the release of these hormones. So this is an example of a feedback loop, and we've talked about feedback loops already. This one just happens to be a hormonal feedback loop. And because this is a loop, we have a negative feedback happening here as well. So the way that these hormones are regulated is by the nervous system, for one, right? Depending on what's happening, what sensory input is coming into the body. A good example is sunlight, for example. So light comes into our eyes. It encourages some of those nuclei in our hypothalamus to release their secretions or not. And so nervous system input, neural input is one way that we can regulate the release of some of these hormones. Hormonal input is another way that we can regulate, excuse me, some of the release of these hormones. And then the circadian rhythm is another way that we can regulate as well. So a good example of that is the female hormonal cycle, right? The menstrual cycle. That is on a natural circadian rhythm. It comes every month. It's on an invisible clock, so to speak, that is sort of keeping a rhythm that we aren't necessarily aware of cognitively. So there are different rhythmic loops or hormonal loops that will encourage the release of some of the hormones that we talked about, as well as just the nervous system input as far as the neural input. Another good example of the circadian rhythm is the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus. That is going to be receptive to seasons, right? This is the reason that sometimes in this part of the year, we have things like seasonal depression because the days become shorter, there's less of that natural light onto the retina, and so some of the hormones are dysregulated during that period, which can lead to things like serotonin levels dropping, and we know serotonin is that happy hormone. It keeps our mood in balance. And so when there's not as much light coming in during this period of the year, we can see things like that seasonal depression start to creep up. So this is why, or how rather, these three inputs can affect some of those hormone releases and that axis that we just described. Okay, so here is an illustration of this axis. And we're going to talk about two different types of negative feedback loops. So we should know at this point what a negative feedback loop is, right? It's where a hormone is released and then it has the ability to go back, right, and shut off or decrease the initial signal for that hormone. So there are two different feedback loops that we see. There's a short feedback loop and a long feedback loop. Let's look at the long feedback loop first. So we have one hormone being secreted from the hypothalamus. That is going to encourage a second hormone being released from the anterior pituitary. And then that is going to encourage a third hormone being released from the endocrine gland itself. A good example here would be maybe the thyroid gland, right? So we have thyroid releasing hormone released from the hypothalamus, thyroid stimulating hormone released from the anterior pituitary, and then thyroid hormone itself, T3, T4, being released from the thyroid gland. Now, increased levels of thyroid hormone, which is T3 and T4, can actually go back and negatively affect the hypothalamus and block the further secretion of thyroid releasing hormone. So this is an example of a long negative feedback. A short negative feedback would be thyroid stimulating hormone, which is coming from the anterior pituitary, having that exact same effect, going back up to the hypothalamus and inhibiting the secretion of thyroid releasing hormone. Okay, so there are 2 points where we have the hormones that are released at each of these stages, whether it be from the anterior pituitary or the endocrine gland itself. Excess release of that hormone can be a negative influence onto the hypothalamus and can block the release of the thyroid releasing hormone or the hormone from the hypothalamus, whether it be prolactin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone. Any of those hormones can be shut off from the other hormones that are released along that axis.